Evelyn Carter only wanted to leave the underground garage after a late meeting, but 5 men had already sealed the exit, forcing her back between rows of dark sedans. They assumed the quiet driver beside her was nothing more than a poor man hired by the hour. When one of them seized her wrist, Lucas Reed silently removed his jacket, laid it across the hood of a car, and let his gaze turn cold. None of them knew that beneath that ordinary surface stood a man who had survived missions that never appeared in any official record, not even once. Stay until the very end, because the sudden reversal in that garage will make every arrogant person pay the price. Carter Dynamics occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, and on the 32nd floor, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a long table, reviewing the final pages of a merger contract worth billions of dollars. She was 32 years old, sharp-eyed, and known throughout the industry for never raising her voice even when the numbers in front of her threatened to collapse an entire quarter. Evelyn had built her reputation on control, on reading a room before anyone else understood what was happening inside it, and on trusting the systems her father had once put in place to keep the company safe. That trust, though she did not yet realize it, had grown a little too comfortable, a little too unquestioned, the kind of confidence that made a person stop checking the locks on doors they assumed had always been secure. That same week, the regular driver assigned to Evelyn's executive car had taken sudden medical leave, and the staffing agency sent a replacement named Lucas Reed. He arrived in a plain gray jacket, work boots that had clearly been resoled more than once, and a quiet, unremarkable face that drew no second glances in the elevator lobby. Lucas spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes forward, and moved through the marble hallways of Carter Dynamics as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. Mason Blake, the company's ambitious vice president, made a point of mocking him within earshot of other staff, calling him the kind of man who had failed at everything except holding a steering wheel. Lucas never answered back. He simply nodded, opened the car door, and waited. Evelyn herself held no particular malice toward the new driver, but she carried the same quiet dismissal that came naturally to people who had never needed to wonder where their next paycheck would come from. She noticed his calloused hands when he opened her door, the way his sleeves were always pressed despite clearly being worn thin, and she assumed without unkindness that this was simply what an ordinary life looked like. There were small signs, if anyone had cared to look closer, that Lucas carried responsibilities far heavier than a driving schedule. He answered certain calls outside in the parking garage rather than the lobby, his voice low and careful, the tone of a man arranging logistics for someone who depended on him completely, though he never spoke of who that might be. On the third evening, the board called an unexpected late session regarding the merger, and Evelyn found herself staying long after the rest of the staff had gone home, the towers around Carter Dynamics dimming one by one into darkness. Lucas waited in the underground garage as instructed, but unlike the previous driver, he did not simply sit in the car checking messages on his phone. He walked the perimeter once, checked the emergency exit doors, glanced at the security camera mounted near the elevator bank, and noted, almost without meaning to, that one of the bulbs near the ramp had been deliberately loosened rather than burned out. It was a small detail, the kind only a trained eye would catch, and Lucas filed it away the way he filed away every detail that didn't sit right, quietly, without alarm, the old instinct from another life surfacing for just a moment before he pushed it back down. Inside the executive boardroom, Mason Blake leaned forward with a folder of documents he had reviewed perhaps 100 times, pressing Evelyn to sign an additional clause buried deep within the merger agreement. He framed it as a routine formality, something the lawyers on the other side had requested at the last moment, nothing that should hold up a deal this important. Evelyn reached for her pen out of habit, the kind of habit born from years of trusting the people closest to her, but something in Mason's tone, a slight eagerness he could not quite hide, made her pause. She asked Diana Carter, her longtime legal advisor and distant cousin, to review the clause one more time before anything was finalized, and it was that single request that would end up saving everything. Diana read through the clause twice, her expression shifting from polite attention to genuine alarm, and she quietly slid a note across the table rather than speaking aloud. The clause, hidden beneath dense legal language about transitional governance, would have transferred emergency operational control of Carter Dynamics to a newly formed oversight committee, one that Mason himself had quietly arranged to chair. Evelyn set down her pen entirely and announced, calmly but firmly, that she would not sign anything until a full audit of the merger documents had been completed by an independent team. Mason's jaw tightened for only a fraction of a second before he forced a smile, agreeing that caution was always wise, though the look in his eyes told a different story to anyone paying close attention. The moment the meeting paused for a short break, Mason stepped into a private hallway and sent a brief message to Connor Hayes, the head of corporate security, a man who had worked under Mason's quiet influence for nearly 2 years. Outside in the corridor, Lucas happened to be waiting near the elevator bank when he noticed an unusual rotation of security personnel, men switching posts at hours that did not match the building's normal schedule. He said nothing, because suspicion without evidence was worth very little, and a driver questioning the security team would only invite the kind of attention he had spent years trying to avoid. Still, he made a mental note of every face, every badge number he could read from a distance, the old training never fully leaving him even after all this time. When the meeting finally ended, Mason walked Evelyn to the elevator with exaggerated warmth, wishing her a good night and assuring her that everything would be resolved once the audit confirmed what he already knew to be true. Evelyn nodded politely, though exhaustion had settled deep into her shoulders, and she barely registered Lucas suggesting, in his usual quiet voice, that they take the secondary route down to the garage instead of the main elevator. She found the suggestion strange, almost presumptuous for a temporary driver to question, and told him plainly that the main elevator had always been fine and would continue to be fine tonight. Lucas did not argue, only nodded once, and pressed the call button, and when the doors finally opened onto the garage level, the lighting beyond was dimmer than either of them remembered it ever being before. The underground garage stretched out in long rows of concrete pillars and parked vehicles, and the moment the elevator doors slid shut behind them, Evelyn noticed the silence pressing in from every direction. The overhead lights flickered twice before settling into a dim, uneven glow, and the side roller door that normally stayed open for late staff departures had been pulled down and locked. She reached for her phone out of instinct, only to find the signal reduced to a single flickering bar, the kind of dead zone that should never exist in a building with this much security infrastructure. Lucas walked half a step ahead of her now, his posture subtly different, his eyes moving across the garage in a slow, deliberate sweep that had nothing to do with looking for a parked car. When they reached the spot where Evelyn's car should have been waiting, 2 black sport utility vehicles sat parked diagonally across the lane instead, blocking any clear path to the exit ramp. 5 men emerged from the shadows between the pillars, dressed in dark, unmarked clothing, moving with the practiced calm of people who had done this kind of work before. At the front of the group stood Connor Hayes, his security badge still clipped to his jacket, as though that small detail might somehow make this look legitimate. He told Evelyn in a tone far too casual for the situation that all she needed to do was sign an emergency transfer document waiting in the car, and then she would be free to go home without any further trouble. Evelyn straightened her spine and forced her voice to stay level, though her mind was racing through every version of this moment that made any sense at all, and none of them did. This was no longer a disagreement over a merger clause or a difficult quarter. This was something else entirely, something with men positioned at every exit and a building that had gone strangely, deliberately quiet around them. Lucas had drifted slightly behind her now, not out of fear but out of habit, his eyes cataloging the distance between each man, the position of the vehicles, the single camera blinking uselessly near the ceiling, and the narrow gap beside the far pillar that no one seemed to be watching closely. One of the men laughed under his breath and told Lucas to hand over the car keys and disappear, suggesting that whatever happened next was none of his concern as a hired driver. Evelyn, despite everything, found herself ordering the men to step aside, her voice carrying the same authority she used in boardrooms, though authority meant very little to men who had already decided how this would end. Connor took one step closer, his patience visibly thinning, and gestured for one of his men to move things along faster than they had planned. It was in that exact moment that one of the men reached out and closed his hand tightly around Evelyn's wrist, and Lucas, without raising his voice at all, said quietly that he should let go of her right now. Lucas had felt something uneasy building since the moment the elevator doors closed, an instinct sharpened over years that had nothing to do with hearing or sight and everything to do with the way a room felt wrong before any visible danger appeared. It was the same quiet alertness that had once kept him alive in places far more hostile than a corporate parking garage, a sense he had tried for a long time to bury beneath ordinary routines, school pickups, oil changes, and quiet evenings that asked nothing extraordinary of him. He had told himself more than once over the past few years that this part of his life was finished, that the version of him capable of reading a room like a battlefield no longer needed to exist. Standing now among the concrete pillars with the air gone still and wrong around him, he understood that some instincts never truly retire, no matter how many ordinary years a person tries to build on top of them. Evelyn, for her part, had spent the entire elevator ride composing the apology she planned to offer Lucas later for dismissing his earlier suggestion about taking a different route through the building. She had not yet realized how much more than an apology this night would eventually demand of her, nor how thoroughly her understanding of strength and worth was about to be rearranged. The garage smelled faintly of exhaust and cold concrete, and somewhere above them, the building hummed faintly with the ordinary business of a company that had no idea anything was wrong yet. It was a strange kind of quiet, the kind that exists in the half-second before something breaks, and both of them, in their own separate ways, felt it settling over the space like a held breath that refused to release. The man holding Evelyn's wrist let go just long enough to shove Lucas backward into the hood of the nearest car, assuming, as everyone else in that garage assumed, that he was dealing with nothing more than a tired driver who would crumple at the first sign of real force. Lucas did not strike back immediately. Instead, he glanced once toward Evelyn, making certain she had stepped fully behind him, his expression unreadable, his breathing slow and even in a way that did not match the situation at all. Connor laughed again, calling Lucas a poor man trying to play hero for a woman who would never remember his name once this was over, the kind of insult meant to provoke a reckless, foolish response. Lucas reached up and began unbuttoning his jacket with unhurried, almost ceremonial movements, the same way a man might prepare for work he had done 1,000 times before. He folded it carefully along its seams and set it down across the hood of the car beside him, smoothing one sleeve flat with the back of his hand. Something in the air shifted the instant his jacket touched the metal, a change so subtle that only Evelyn, standing closest, seemed to feel it pulling through her chest like a held breath. His shoulders had dropped into a different kind of stillness, his weight settling low and balanced, no longer the posture of a driver but something colder, older, and far more deliberate. He reached up next and unfastened his watch, sliding it into his pocket without looking down, then rolled back his cuffs with 2 quick motions, his eyes never leaving the men in front of him. One man, impatient and overconfident, lunged forward first, swinging wide in a motion meant to end things quickly and decisively. Lucas stepped half a pace to the side instead of backward, caught the man's wrist mid-swing, and used the very momentum of the attack to drive him down into the concrete with a controlled, economical force that left him groaning but conscious. 2 more men rushed in together from opposite directions, clearly expecting to overwhelm him through sheer numbers alone, but Lucas moved between them as though he had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times in 100 different rooms. Evelyn watched, frozen, as Lucas neutralized each man with a precision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with control, never striking harder than necessary, never lingering on a man once he was down. There was no wasted motion in anything he did, no flailing, no panic, only a calm, almost surgical rhythm that turned 5 confident attackers into a scattered, groaning mess within the space of a few short breaths. Connor stood frozen near the back of the group, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his face as he finally understood, far too late, that the man he had dismissed as a poor driver was nothing of the sort. The garage had gone almost silent again, save for low groans and uneven breathing, and Connor's hand hovered uselessly near his radio as though he no longer trusted himself to give another order. Lucas used the cramped geometry of the garage the way another man might use an open field, turning every car door, every concrete column, every shadow between the overhead lights into something he could fight from or behind. When one of the remaining men pulled a folding knife from his belt, Evelyn let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, certain that this was the moment everything would turn unforgivably worse. Lucas, however, only adjusted his stance slightly, watching the blade rather than the man's eyes, and when the strike finally came, he wrapped his folded jacket around his forearm and used it to deflect the blade before twisting the man's wrist sharply enough to send the knife clattering across the concrete floor and far out of reach. Connor, watching his men fall one after another, finally broke and barked into his radio for immediate backup, his earlier composure replaced now by something closer to panic. Evelyn, pressed against a concrete pillar exactly where Lucas had quietly guided her minutes earlier, caught sight of an old, faded scar across his shoulder where his shirt had torn loose during the struggle. It was the kind of scar that did not come from an accident or an ordinary life. the kind she had only ever seen described in vague, classified terms during a security briefing years ago about a secretive rescue unit that operated without official acknowledgement. She remembered hearing rumors once, in passing, about men who had pulled hostages out of conflict zones the government never publicly admitted existed, men whose names never appeared anywhere, men who simply vanished back into ordinary life once their work was done. Lucas never paused to explain any of it, never looked for recognition in her eyes, only told her steadily to stay behind the pillar and not move until she heard him say it was safe. Connor screamed that every exit in the garage had already been sealed, his voice cracking with something close to desperation now, as though saying it loudly enough might make it true again. Lucas answered without even raising his voice, telling him calmly that a locked door only matters to someone who does not know how to open it, a statement that carried the quiet weight of absolute certainty rather than bravado. He moved toward the nearest fallen man, crouched briefly, and lifted a security badge from his jacket pocket, turning it over once in his fingers before tucking it away. With the badge secured, Lucas guided Evelyn toward a narrow service corridor tucked behind the elevator shaft, one most employees never noticed because it was meant only for maintenance staff and emergency technicians. The corridor smelled faintly of machine oil and old paint, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent tube overhead, but it offered something far more valuable than comfort in that moment, which was distance from Connor and the chaos still unfolding behind them. Evelyn followed without question now, her earlier doubts about Lucas dissolving with every step, replaced instead by a slow, dawning understanding of exactly how wrong she had been about the quiet man who had been driving her car all week. Behind them, the sound of Connor's voice grew fainter, swallowed by concrete and distance, until it disappeared entirely into the hum of the building's machinery. The service corridor opened eventually into a quiet maintenance hallway lined with pipes and electrical panels, far enough from the garage that the sounds of struggle had faded completely into silence. Lucas did not suggest they run for the street immediately, even though every instinct in Evelyn's body screamed that they should, because he understood something she did not yet fully grasp, that Mason still held a forged version of the merger contract and would use Evelyn's disappearance to seize control before anyone could stop him. Evelyn finally turned to him in the dim light and asked, her voice quieter than she intended, who he really was beneath the jacket and the driving schedule and the quiet nods in hallways. Lucas hesitated for a long moment before answering, choosing his words the way a man chooses them when certain truths are simply not meant to be spoken aloud in detail. He told her only that he had once done work that should never be discussed again, work that had cost him more than most people would understand, and that he had walked away from it a long time ago to build something quieter and safer for the people who depended on him now. Evelyn studied his face and, for the first time since meeting him, saw past the plain jacket and tired eyes to something steadier underneath, something that had nothing to do with money or title at all. She apologized then, simply and without excuse, for judging him by his clothing and his job title the moment they had first met in the lobby. Lucas shook his head gently and told her there was no need to apologize, that people with money and power often saw a title before they ever saw the person standing behind it, and that this was simply the way of things more often than not. Their conversation ended abruptly when both of them heard footsteps echoing down the corridor behind them, heavy and hurried, clearly searching rather than wandering. Lucas guided Evelyn quickly into a small maintenance closet stacked with cleaning supplies and spare filters, motioning for her to stay low and silent, before slipping back out to draw the footsteps away from her hiding place entirely. For the first time, Evelyn watched a man risk himself for her not because he was paid to, not because his contract required it, but simply because it was the right thing to do, and something in her understanding of the world quietly rearranged itself in that moment. Alone in the closet, Evelyn used an old internal phone line mounted near the supply shelves, one she barely remembered existed, to reach Diana directly rather than risk her cellular signal being tracked. Diana answered immediately, her voice tight with worry, and confirmed Evelyn's worst fear, that Mason had already called an emergency board session, claiming Evelyn had suffered a breakdown and vanished from the building under suspicious circumstances. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing the way she had learned to do during the hardest negotiations of her career, and made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not run from this building tonight. She would walk back into it, with whatever evidence she could gather, and face Mason directly in front of the very people he was trying to turn against her. Upstairs, in a glass conference room that overlooked the darkened skyline, Mason Blake addressed the board members through a hastily arranged video call, his voice carrying the practiced sorrow of a man delivering terrible news he claimed to wish were untrue. He explained, with documents already prepared and printed, that Evelyn had vanished from the building under troubling circumstances, hinting carefully at exhaustion, stress, and instability without ever quite saying the words outright. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, none of them entirely convinced, but none of them willing to interrupt a man who appeared, on the surface, to be acting only out of concern for a missing colleague. In the middle of his presentation, Mason's phone buzzed sharply against the table, and he excused himself for a moment to read a message from Connor describing, in frantic, disjointed sentences, exactly what had happened in the garage. The color drained slowly from Mason's face as he read the name Lucas Reed typed out twice in the message, each time followed by a question mark, as though Connor himself could not quite believe what he had witnessed. Mason returned to his office alone and pulled up an old, restricted database his position still gave him partial access to, typing the name in with hands that were no longer entirely steady. What came back was fragmented, heavily redacted, but unmistakable enough to confirm his worst fear, a sealed government file referencing classified extraction operations and a name that matched, letter for letter, the quiet driver he had mocked in front of half the office only days earlier. Mason forced himself to breathe evenly and returned to the call, telling the board that updates were still developing and that security was actively working to locate Evelyn and ensure her safety. Meanwhile, deep within the building, Lucas and Evelyn moved together through a service stairwell toward the executive floor, taking the long, unmonitored route that maintenance staff used during power outages and equipment failures. Lucas warned her quietly that confronting Mason without solid evidence would only give him another opportunity to twist the story in his favor, and that whatever they did next needed proof, not accusations alone. As if summoned by that very need, Evelyn's phone buzzed once with a message from Diana, containing scanned financial records showing unusual transfers between Mason's personal accounts and a rival firm that had been quietly attempting a hostile takeover of Carter Dynamics for months. Evelyn read through the documents twice, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and disbelief at how long this betrayal had apparently been unfolding right beneath her notice. Lucas waited patiently beside her, saying nothing, allowing her the moment she needed before nodding once and gesturing toward the door leading back into the executive corridor. When they finally stepped through it together, Evelyn walked first with her shoulders straight and her chin level, and behind her came Lucas, his shirt still torn at the shoulder, calm as a shadow that refused to be startled by anything the night had shown him so far. Mason had spent nearly 2 years cultivating his position within Carter Dynamics, with the patience of a man who understood that real power was rarely seized in a single dramatic gesture, but built slowly, conversation by conversation, favor by favor, until the right people owed him just enough to look away when it mattered. He had convinced himself somewhere along the way that Evelyn's inheritance of the company made her an obstacle rather than a leader, a temporary placeholder occupying a seat he believed he had earned through years of quiet maneuvering that no one else seemed to notice or appreciate. The rival firm he had been secretly negotiating with for months had promised him a controlling position once the merger collapsed under the weight of manufactured scandal, a promise that now, with Lucas standing unexpectedly in his way, felt suddenly and terrifyingly fragile. As he stared at the redacted file glowing on his screen, Mason found himself recalculating every assumption he had built his entire plan upon, realizing too late that he had underestimated not just one man, but the quiet, patient kind of competence that never announced itself until it was already standing directly in front of him. He thought, briefly and uselessly, of simply abandoning the plan entirely, slipping away before anyone could connect him directly to what had happened in the garage, but pride and desperation in equal measure kept him rooted to the call, still hoping he could somehow talk his way back into control of a story that had already slipped entirely out of his hands. When Evelyn pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, every head at the table turned at once, and Mason rose from his chair with a performance of overwhelming relief that did not quite reach his eyes. He moved toward her as though to embrace her, asking loudly where she had been and whether she was hurt, while simultaneously gesturing for someone to call security regarding the disheveled man standing quietly behind her. Evelyn raised a single hand, stopping Mason mid-sentence, and asked the room, in a voice that carried easily despite its calm, why the garage cameras had been disabled earlier that evening and why Connor Hayes had been seen escorting an emergency transfer document down to the parking levels. Mason's composure flickered for just a moment before he recovered, insisting that he had no knowledge of any disabled cameras or any document beyond the standard merger paperwork already discussed earlier that day. Lucas stepped forward then, calm and unhurried, and placed several items on the polished conference table one by one: a stolen security badge, a folding knife still faintly smeared with concrete dust, a security radio still chirping with static, and a small audio recording pulled from one of the fallen men's phones. The recording, though brief, captured a voice clearly instructing the men to retrieve a signed document from Evelyn by whatever means necessary before sunrise. Diana, seated quietly near the end of the table until now, stood and connected her laptop to the main screen, displaying the financial transfers she had uncovered, each one time-stamped and tied directly back to accounts under Mason's personal control. A heavy silence spread across the room as board members began glancing at one another, their earlier sympathy for Mason curdling visibly into suspicion and disbelief. Before anyone could speak further, the boardroom doors burst open again, and Connor entered with 3 remaining security personnel still loyal to him, his expression wild with the desperation of a man who understood there was no path left except force. He pointed at Lucas, shouting that the man had assaulted company security and needed to be restrained immediately, conveniently omitting any mention of what had actually happened in the garage only minutes before. Lucas did not move toward anyone, did not raise his hands defensively, only positioned himself calmly between Connor's men and Evelyn, his stillness more unsettling to the room than any shouted threat could ever be. Mason, sensing the room slipping irreversibly away from him, abandoned his earlier composure entirely and shouted that Evelyn had never truly been fit to run a company of this size, that she had inherited everything and earned nothing. Words that landed with an ugliness no one in that room would soon forget. It was in that exact moment, with accusations and chaos colliding from every direction at once, that Connor finally gave the order for his men to take hold of both Evelyn and Lucas right there in front of the entire watching board. Connor's men moved forward together. But the boardroom offered none of the open space the garage had given Lucas earlier, only chairs, a long table, and a dozen frightened executives pressed against the walls trying to stay out of the way. Lucas adjusted instantly, using the confined space to his advantage rather than against it, sidestepping a chair rather than knocking it over, guiding one man's momentum into the back of another rather than throwing a single unnecessary punch. Within seconds, 2 of Connor's men were on the floor, disarmed and groaning, while Connor himself lunged forward in a final, desperate attempt to grab Evelyn directly. Lucas caught his arm mid-motion, twisted it firmly behind his back, and pressed him down against the conference table with controlled, almost gentle force, holding him there until the fight visibly drained out of his body entirely. The room had fallen completely silent except for Connor's ragged breathing, and into that silence one of the older board members, a man named Harold Whitfield who had served on the board for over 20 years, slowly rose to his feet. He stared at Lucas for a long moment, his expression shifting from shock to something closer to recognition, before asking quietly whether his name was truly Lucas Reed. When Lucas gave a small, hesitant nod, Harold explained, his voice trembling slightly, that he remembered a classified briefing from years earlier describing a covert rescue operation that had saved several American executives and diplomats from a kidnapping situation overseas, an operation whose details had never been made public and whose lead operative had never been named, except in whispers among a select few who had access to the file. Diana, working quickly at her laptop, pulled up a sealed legal record she had quietly requested weeks earlier for an unrelated security review, and confirmed aloud what Harold had only suspected, that Lucas Reed had indeed received a classified commendation years before for actions that had saved the lives of engineers, executives, and diplomats during an operation that remained unacknowledged by any public agency. Evelyn stood frozen at the center of the room, staring at the man she had hired as a temporary driver only days earlier, struggling to reconcile the quiet, unassuming figure she had barely noticed with the description. Harold and Diana were now describing in careful, reverent tones. Lucas, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention, asked only that someone call the authorities and ensure none of the innocent employees in the building were harmed any further tonight. Mason, watching his carefully built narrative collapse entirely around him, made a final frantic dash toward a private elevator reserved for senior executives, clearly hoping to disappear before anyone could stop him. Evelyn moved first this time, stepping directly into his path with her phone already raised. showing him the financial records Diana had gathered, now already forwarded to the appropriate regulatory authorities along with a detailed account of everything that had transpired that night. Mason's shoulders sagged in defeat as two uniformed officers, summoned by hotel security only minutes earlier, stepped off the very elevator he had been racing toward, taking him into custody without resistance. Lucas, finished and unhurried, walked quietly back toward where his jacket had been left on a chair near the door, lifting it gently and folding it once more across his arm, as though the entire confrontation had cost him nothing at all. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he sat back down, the weight of memory settling over him visibly, the kind of memory a man carries quietly for years without ever expecting it to surface again in a boardroom on an ordinary evening. He explained, his voice softer now, that the operation he remembered had taken place far from any cameras or headlines, in a region where diplomacy had failed and quiet, deniable action had been the only option left to bring a group of stranded executives home alive. He had only ever seen a single line in a briefing document referencing the operatives' results. Never a name, never a face, until tonight when both had finally appeared in front of him without warning. The other board members listened in stunned silence, many of them recalculating in real time every dismissive remark they had ever made about the quiet driver who brought their coffee and held open their car doors without complaint. Evelyn felt something shift permanently inside her as she listened, a slow unraveling of every assumption she had built about competence, status, and worth over the course of her entire career. She had spent years surrounded by people who announced their value loudly, who wore it in tailored suits and corner offices, and she had never once paused to consider that the most capable person in any given room might be the one who said the least and asked for nothing in return. It was a humbling realization, uncomfortable in the way truth often is, but Evelyn found she did not resent it. If anything, she felt strangely grateful that the lesson had arrived now, while there was still time to change how she saw the people around her for the rest of her life. By morning, news of the betrayal had spread quietly through every department of Carter Dynamics, carried in hushed conversations near coffee machines and in the careful, measured tone of internal memos sent out before the workday officially began. Evelyn held a short briefing for senior staff rather than any public statement, choosing her words with great care, revealing only that an employee with a far more complicated past than anyone realized had stepped in to protect both her and the company during a serious security breach. She deliberately left out every classified detail Harold and Diana had uncovered the night before, understanding instinctively that Lucas had spent years building a quiet life specifically, so that such details would never need to be spoken aloud in a crowded room again. Within days, Evelyn dismissed the entire security division connected to Connor's authority, replacing it with a temporary external team, while Diana personally oversaw a complete legal restructuring of the company's internal protocols. The board, shaken but grateful, supported every decision she made without hesitation, the earlier doubts Mason had tried so hard to plant having evaporated entirely in the face of what everyone had witnessed firsthand. Evelyn herself, however, found her thoughts returning again and again not to the company's recovery, but to the quiet man who had disappeared from the building sometime before sunrise, without waiting for thanks or recognition of any kind. She found him 3 days later in a small, modest garage tucked into a quieter part of the city, the kind of place with a single hydraulic lift and a radio playing softly in the background, while Lucas worked beneath the hood of an aging sedan that clearly belonged to someone who could not afford a newer one. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway, wiping his hands on a faded rag, his expression neither surprised nor particularly eager, simply calm in the same way it had been calm through everything that had happened. Evelyn offered him a generous financial reward on behalf of the company, a sum large enough to change most people's lives entirely, and Lucas, without hesitation or offense, politely declined it. He explained, simply and without bitterness, that what he needed was not charity or a payout for one difficult night, but the chance to do honest work without anyone questioning his worth based on his bank account or his job title. Evelyn considered this for a long moment before offering something different entirely, a position as a special security consultant for Carter Dynamics, one structured entirely around his own terms, including the right to refuse any assignment he considered too dangerous or too far outside the boundaries he had set for himself. Lucas hesitated, clearly torn between the quiet, predictable life he had built and the pull of meaningful work that might actually matter again, and Evelyn, sensing his hesitation, made it clear she would respect whatever decision he made without pressure or disappointment. After a long pause, Lucas finally agreed on the condition that the work remained limited, careful, and entirely on his terms, a compromise that felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something neither had expected to find that week. What Evelyn did not know, and what Lucas had no intention of mentioning unless it became absolutely necessary, was that every difficult shift he took, every odd job he accepted without complaint, existed for a reason far more important than his own comfort. There was a small apartment across town where a young child waited for him most evenings. A quiet life he protected fiercely, one he had built specifically to be as far removed from danger and attention as possible. He had walked away from his old work precisely because that life demanded steadiness more than anything else. A father who came home every night, who showed up for ordinary moments instead of disappearing into missions no one could ever speak about afterward. The events in the garage had not been a choice he made lightly. He had simply understood, in the moment it mattered, that walking away while someone needed help was a price he was no longer willing to pay, regardless of what it might cost him personally. Evelyn sensed there was more beneath his careful answers than he was willing to share, but she did not press him for details he clearly preferred to keep private. She had learned enough about him already to understand that respect meant allowing a person their boundaries, rather than demanding access to every corner of their life, simply because curiosity made it tempting. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of something neither of them rushed to name, built not on dramatic declarations but on the simple, steady understanding that some of the strongest people in the world carry their burdens silently, asking only to be seen clearly for who they actually are. Several weeks passed, and Carter Dynamics gradually settled back into a steady, manageable rhythm, the merger negotiations resuming under far more careful scrutiny than before. Mason and Connor faced formal charges, their cases moving slowly through the legal system, while the shareholders who had quietly supported their scheme found themselves removed from the company entirely, one by one, as Diana's restructuring continued to uncover the full scope of the betrayal. Evelyn used the experience to reshape the culture of her company in ways both small and significant, instituting new policies that discouraged employees from judging colleagues based on appearance, title, or income, and encouraging instead a workplace where character mattered more than any line on a resume. Lucas remained exactly as he had always been, unassuming and steady, never seeking credit for what had happened, never allowing the story to follow him into rooms where he simply wanted to do quiet, honest work. Evelyn found herself understanding, more with each passing week, that his true strength had never really been the speed of his hands or the precision of his movements in that garage, but something far quieter, his ability to hold on to decency even after years of carrying burdens most people would never be able to imagine. Their relationship grew slowly after that, built not on dramatic gestures but on small moments of mutual respect, shared coffee in the early mornings before board meetings, quiet conversations about nothing important that somehow felt more honest than anything discussed in a conference room. Neither of them rushed toward anything resembling certainty, content instead to let trust accumulate naturally, the way it does between two people who have already seen each other at their most unguarded and found nothing there to regret. On a quiet evening months later, Evelyn walked through the same underground garage where everything had once nearly gone terribly wrong, the overhead lights now fully repaired and humming steadily overhead. She found Lucas standing beside a car near the same spot where he had once calmly removed his jacket, only this time he was simply putting it back on, the same plain gray fabric, worn soft now from years of quiet, ordinary use. This time, when Evelyn looked at him, she did not see a driver, a temporary hire, or a man whose worth could be measured by his job title or his bank account. She saw, instead, the man who had saved her life without asking for anything in return, the man who had quietly taught her to look past the surface of people and see what truly mattered underneath. In a world that so often rewarded loud confidence and empty titles, it was the quietest, most overlooked man in the room who had proven, when it mattered most, strong enough to stand tall while every powerful person around him had ultimately bowed their heads.